Right, I reconvene the hearing for our current stream, which is stream 3, and we're going to continue to work through the 42A report and supplementary evidence from Ms. Joanne Scoose. Hand over to you.
Well, I guess it's questions from us, and it might be easiest just to deal with what we've heard this morning and any further questions we've got. You were talking about getting together with Planner from Greenbrier and what sort of timing you're looking at to come back to us.
Yes, so I had a brief discussion with the planner after in the break this morning, and we are going to confer tomorrow and hope to have some semblance of wording back to the panel in terms of changes that we would both be comfortable with. I just need to do a little bit of background reading and making sure that what I sort of agree to be comfortable with, that I am happy in terms of our obligations and responsibilities. So there's just a few, I guess, whilst I appreciate the content that the submitters brought this morning, we do need to consider that this plan is a district-wide plan and we're not writing the plan for one submitter. And I just think that's an important point to make, even in relation to other things such as setbacks and multiple sites and farm operations. I understand that that's a consideration, but we still need to be reminded that the plan is applicable across the district, not just to one farming operation. But yes, I will have something back for you in relation to the stream setbacks.
Will that include having a brief look at Environment Southland's water plan and the way that they've defined holdings? Yes,
definitely. I think the points and the discussion that we had yesterday around farm quarries and how we manage farm operation in that respect is extremely valid, and I do think that there's potential there in utilising an existing definition that is utilised by Environment Southland. My other comments from this morning, just I guess based on reflection, and there was a lot of detail that we went through with Greenbrier, which was helpful. The National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land is an extensive piece of national direction, and it does introduce these ideas of tests and doesn't necessarily provide us with clear tools on how to achieve them or what the definition of achieving them is. But I think what might be helpful in terms of this national policy statement and the section that we're looking at, which is 3.9, is that whilst that test is a component, and whilst we've got evidence that says that they do meet it, there's still other parts of that 3.9 section that which enables us to have further management or of activities, and that is just in relation to the territorial authority taking measures to minimise and mitigate actual loss of potential cumulative loss of productive land. So in that respect, whilst I think that test is obviously an important point of working through the NPS, it's not the only aspect, and once met, that doesn't mean that there's not additional steps that can be taken to manage highly productive land. And the matters of discretion that are currently in the plan, in my opinion, are tools that can be then used to minimise and mitigate. And that is things like ensuring that the soil is productive upon remediation, or there's a point here about having environmental management plans. So I guess I'm just highlighting that whilst that test can raise questions in terms of what bar is being set, we still then do have means through the NPS in terms of managing highly productive soil. And I guess that comes back to my kind of conclusions around the decision in terms of the district plan might be looking at that precinct And I think it's important that we acknowledge that there is an existing activity and the precinct facilitates the existing activity. And whilst that may mean that while we are creating the pathway for them to extend, but we are by no means giving them the tick to extend the mine. It's just about putting in the right framework to enable the pathway. But in my opinion, there's still work to be done in terms of meeting the NPS HPL.
So are they going to go back and test soil now to see if they meet that high class soil? Because there was some discussion about that, them testing before and after. I'm just wondering if they could test after now to that land that they've reconstructed, whether it comes under that high class soil.
The test is not what is actually in the soil, it's what's shown on the maps. And the land is shown on the maps is meeting the test, so that's it.
So there's no test to test that?
The scale of those maps, which was at 1 inch to the mile, meant that, and we're dealing with the old metric system, areas up to 10 hectares that had certain characteristics would not show up at that scale. So you could end up with variability on the land. So it's a tool for management at a slightly wider level, not at a paddock by paddock level. If the conditions on the consent said the land had to be reinstated to a certain quality, there'd be some debate about what the quality is now versus what you reinstate it to. But that's not an issue for us to consider as part of this process.
Would we not need to consider that to know that they are actually what they say they're doing is actually correct?
Well, for the plan provisions, we're setting the framework. Their consent that they've got in may get into that type of issue.
Right.
I'd make the point that land rehabilitation is not a new activity. It's well understood, particularly with gold mines that have been in the region. So in the our mine site visit, they had definitely working to a plan rather than just a ad hoc. We'll dump it here and we'll dump it there. I have spoken to a soil scientist out there quite some time ago, and I'd said, yeah.
So I think your point, Ms. Hughes, is that those territorial authority responsibilities in the NPS HPL are where our care around the provisions comes into play. And in doing that, we're obviously trying to meet that overarching objective of the,
To comment that it's really good there is no toxicity in the soils. That was a question that we asked when we were doing the site visit. John said there is no toxicity like some mining operations.
Yeah, the other thing from Greenbrier reference was made by Claire to the Environment Court decision that defined farm infrastructure. Is that something you're intending to have a quick look at?
Yes, so that was in relation to an Environment Court decision that concluded that those pivot irrigation machinery are buildings. So the way that Claire and I have dealt with that is the original definition that they proposed for farm infrastructure said that it was structures and then in brackets not including buildings. But given that Environment Court decision has suggested that these pivot type structures are buildings, we need to make sure that we actually do cover both structures and buildings that happen to also be farm infrastructure.
Is that all that came up from your point of view on Greenbrier?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions from us on that? We'll come back to pages in a moment. Okay, so in terms of Stony Creek, was there anything that jumped out of there that you need to come back on?
No, I don't think so. So the farm quarry definition will look at land holding. There was a bit of discussion yesterday around minimum lot size and density. I think the only thing I have to add there is that whilst one aspect of the NPS HBL is to do with fragmenting land and avoiding that by avoiding rural lifestyle, the other aspect is reverse sensitivity and the fact that by having smaller lots and property owners who are not necessarily connected to farming, that's when we gives rise to this reverse sensitivity effect. So I think it's just important to keep both those aspects in mind. And yes, that was everything in relation to Stony Creek. Thank you.
Are we checking on anything to do with the setbacks for streams, bridges, and things like that? Are we?
Yes, I'll come back to you on that once I've talked to Ms. Perkins. But I think that discussion this morning, though, was really helpful in terms of understanding the practicalities in their point of view, but also the responsibilities that we have as district council. And I understand and appreciate that there is overlap, and therefore it can be difficult to determine who's looking at what and when, which is why I just want to be very careful in my responses to you in terms of agreement or not, given that there is just lots of things at play.
Okay, so returning to the Section 42A report, we actually got up to the rezonings that I think we were asking questions on, which takes us through to page 99. And 99 is the New Vale Special Zone that we've just been talking about. And that's goes through to page 108. So at page 109, it talked about renewable electricity, and I had no more questions to raise that can't wait until we're doing deliberations until about page 130 something, so I don't know if people got any questions up to page 130.
Up to or after?
Up to
Up to
130. So while you're looking, I'm looking at page 129, where there was a recommendation for a rewording of policy 6, and we have had some evidence this morning talking about that. And my question related to, it talks in there about where it's not possible to avoid adverse effects from quarrying or mining, require these effects be remedied, mitigated, offset, or compensated for. I think the word possible should be practicable or practical. But what's the difference between offsetting and compensation?
There is a difference. I'm just trying to, I feel that they might both have different definitions, either in the RMA, because offsetting, I think offsetting is more tangible, as in like area, like if you were going to disturb or have issues of disturbance to land, and then you would plant certain amounts of indigenous vegetation, for example. And I do think there is a distinction, but I would have to go away and check that.
Sorry, page 121, GRUZ 5. Primary production. What is the classification of primary production, is that just about animals, or is that crops and horticulture and covers everything?
Yes, so primary production as a definition under the planning standards is extensive. It's I guess, under the current plan that we've got a definition of agricultural activities. So your primary production would include all of those. And then additionally, mining and quarrying.
Mining as well.
Yeah, the way we've written the rules, though, given the MPS HBL has a slightly different approach in terms of primary production. We've got a permitted primary production rule and then separate rules for mining and then quarrying. And that is just a way to manage the fact that whilst the MPS it does discuss primary production and how it's trying to enable it, it does define land use primary production.
Definition is out of our plan that I've just passed on to Commissioner Dixon, and I see that it includes aquaculture, which is theoretically possible in the Mataura River if it was an area was created. So it's what's out of the National Planning Standards. At paragraph 576 on page 133 is a recommended addition that talks about appropriately avoids, remedies or mitigates. Meg Justice made comment this morning on one of the other provisions that had the word or talk to appropriateness. Is the style that the plan's written pointing, does it point to actually having appropriate as part of objectives and policies? Because if you've got avoid, remedy or mitigate, then you've covered all bases. Do we need the word appropriately in our provisions?
Sorry, I'll just read through the policy so I can give you a complete answer.
Because my issue is who decides what's appropriate.
Yes, I understand that there is potentially an element of subjectivity by using words such as appropriately. The policies are to a degree, they're applicable on a case-by-case basis, and there could be an argument that having words such as appropriately may enable more subjective assessment, which could be applied on that more case-by-case basis. I guess what I'm saying is that resource consents come in and they're assessed on their merits, and the policies are applied based on the context and the merits of the application in front of you. And the word appropriately may assist in that assessment. However, given that the intention of the policy is that reverse sensitivity effects are either avoided, remedied or mitigated, you could remove the word appropriately in order to remove any type of subjectivity or ambiguity.
So some of the other provisions in the plan don't have avoid, remedy or mitigates, and so in those cases you think appropriate probably is appropriate.
I think in this case having the words avoid, remedies or mitigates is necessary because it's outlining the intention of the policy.
I'll just go back a wee bit. Paragraph 526, where Forest and Bird make mention of goodness, I've lost it. There's mention here somewhere of erosion prone land, and the remedy suggested by them was fencing off, which suggested in their mind that erosion prone land was due to overstocking, and it was to do around animal agriculture. I don't believe that actually occurs in this district. It is an issue in the central South Island, and I'm not sure that remedy is just exactly right.
Yeah, so in relation to that erosion and stability, I'm assuming you mean in relation to sort of stream banks and things. So we have amended the setback to streams and rivers rule to allow fencing in those setbacks. So you can fence stock out of the stream setbacks by using post and rail fence. The restrictions in relation to using sort of rabbit-proof type fencing, those restrictions are only in play when it's a flood hazard area, and that is just so we don't have instances of that type of fencing capturing debris and then causing downstream effects. But for rivers and streams that do not flood, you can have mesh style fencing within the setbacks, so you can manage stock. And my approach when taking into account submissions from Forest and Bird, equally like with any submitter, I have tried to consider the variables and consider the practicalities, the efficiency and effectiveness of these rules and how they work day to day. And hopefully that's come through in some of my recommendations.
So I'll just note where Commissioner Bulge is pointing at 526, it's around that policy and policy 4. So the Forest and Bird submission is actually, and you've responded to this in the affirmative, that recognise the benefits of conservation pest management, and previously it just said biodiversity, and Forest and Bird were pointing out that that can be any kind of, and you've agreed and suggested protection and enhancement of Indigenous biodiversity is an acceptable response. So I guess that seems to be not just about stock near waterways, but actually the point of the submission is more around that, what kind of biodiversity are we talking about, if I'm interpreting what you've got there correctly?
It wouldn't be the way I'd read it. So just to clarify, are you saying that inside a setback area there can be fencing closer to a waterway, or the setback area is the boundary?
You can have fencing within the setback area, yes.
As long as it's post and wire, if it's...
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. And so that's essentially it's waterborne erosion. You're really wanting to... Well, it can be both, can't it? Yes, it can be.
But does that, like, when reading that, and I marked it as well, does that just mean like there was erosion prone areas, like sort of mid-dome?
That's what I thought.
Yes, and I was thinking that it encompasses places like that on hillsides and not just waterborne erosion. Does it need some clarification there, or do you feel it's any type of erosion? Because I don't think you would fence off slips or so off hillsides.
Yeah, so this policy 4 is in relation to the permitted conservation activities that are enabled through the plan. So this policy is all encompassing in terms of what conservation activities may be undertaken in the district and the benefits from them. So where it does discuss fencing erosion prone areas, it may be appropriate in terms of streams, but that doesn't mean it's not directing anyone to fence every erosion prone area. I think it's giving examples of conservation type activities and the management methods that you may use to manage them.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. Does it create an opportunity for someone to come along and decide, I think that area, which is, 500 acres of a productive farm, is erosion prone. It doesn't open that, it's not ambiguous in that respect.
I don't think so, no. Because I guess you've still got elements of land ownership, and I don't think there's a risk of that type of thing.
I guess I'm concentrating on the word conservation and then linking that to the Department of Conservation and people who then may feel that they have a duty of care on private land. Maybe it's something we'd discuss in our deliberations, and thank you.
Yeah, you are constrained a little bit by the submissions to that provision are generally all in support, and the only one from Forest and Bird was really about the indigenous vegetation increased enhancement.
Yes, I do. Yep. The one that sticks out, and it's obviously had quite a bit of airtime today, is the NPS HPL and how we give effect to that. In GRUZ05, when I read that at the moment, I don't think it does give effect to the objective of the NPS HPL. And my reason for saying that is the definition of primary production, because clearly that's broader than what, in other words, if you look at this objective, it's wanting the availability of highly productive land to be protected for primary production, but that's not an accurate reflection of. So if you remember, even in hearing stream 1, although that was Mr. Heal, I'd started tapping the definitions around these things, and we've already talked about that through this hearing. So because of bringing in the definition of supporting activities, which refers to the land-based primary production, and therefore then we would introduce that term land-based primary production into the plan as well. I'm not sure in terms of scope of submissions how we deal with this particular issue, but for instance, if there are submissions asking that we appropriately give effect to the NPS HPL or something, there might be something within the suite of submissions that we have that enables us to take another look at this objective, because at the moment I don't think it is doing the right thing, if that's what it's meant to do.
Yes, so I do think we have scope in submissions. So I remember looking at this objective, and the original request was for that change of highly productive to rural land. I think this objective has a twofold purpose. The general rural zone, whilst the MPS HPL is a big part of that, the general rural zone is also the place for activities that are not necessarily land-based primary production, but are primary production and do need to go into the rural zone.
Yes, and so you've hit the nail on the head, because when I looked at this, I saw exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
There are two parts to
We
it
can
doing two different things.
Tweak it, yeah.
Yeah.
So what I'm re-looking at this now, I think the first part of the objective talks about the value and the long-term benefits of using rural land for primary production. That's one part of it. And then the second part, primary production is recognised, and the availability of highly productive land. And I think where we've got that second primary production, we could change that to land use-based primary production for future generations as protected. So on the one hand, we've got the rural zone is the place for primary production activities such as quarrying, such as mining, because the operation, functional and operation need, that's where they need to go. But on the other hand, we do recognise that the MPS HPL has a focus on highly productive land and then land-based primary production. So, and the submission that we had on that was all around this talk of highly productive land versus rural land, and making sure we provide for both, because both are important in terms of the district's economic, social, and the rest. So yeah, I do think there is scope in the submissions to do that, and I do think that's a really valid point, that we make sure we encompass both appropriately.
So should we split the objective into two so as to make it clearer?
We could do. But there is a bit of overlap in terms of primary production and land-based use primary production doesn't necessarily have to go on highly productive soil. Like I think the original submission was around actually recognising that all of the soil resources is valuable, but we've just got this higher bar for land-based production and highly productive soil. But I think might need to look at the submission again in terms of scope.
I guess I'm asking, if you split it into two, then could you use the word rehabilitate highly productive land? You couldn't have that district-wide, because you could do anything as long as you rehabilitated it. Because, yeah. Please.
I think rehabilitation is really relevant for those types of activities that are disturbing the land soil base, i.e. mining and quarrying. So there's an aspect of that where, similar to what the submitter's lawyer was talking about this morning, where in a very small sense, it's temporary in that eventually the activity will stop, and then what are we left with? So remediation, I think, in that respect is really important for those types of activities. But for general farming practice, I think, and as we've discussed previously before, the farmers, they're aware of the use of their land, they're aware of their own resource and what it means for their own economic sort of future benefit. So I'm quite comfortable that that objective sets an outcome, and we don't need to over-regulate in terms of how to maintain it.
No, I'm thinking more of the delineation between traditional pastoral farming and extractive activity, which is in the primary, broadly under the primary production label. Another question on from that, while you're thinking of that answer: do you preserve highly productive land, and you've got a consent to plant trees on it? And thinking, is that?
Yeah, so the MPS HPL, in its definition of land-based primary production, it includes forestry. So it is, I think that is quite difficult to grapple with, because as we've heard from submissions, is an argument that, you know, forestry can remove our ability for land use based production. Unfortunately, given that forestry is included in that definition in the MPS, I'm not sure there's much more I can. But what we can do, and what we discussed yesterday, is now that we've got the NES for commercial forestry, which gives councils powers to have a little bit more control around those forestry activities, we can then look at ways of managing it through that. So we talked about that yesterday in terms of the woodlot rule and sort of larger woodlots that actually are carbon forestry, for example. That's actually maybe something we should discuss in terms of if you wanted further comment or understanding scope of submissions in terms of rules around woodlots, or separate rules for carbon forestry and their associated policies. Maybe we just need to discuss that as well.
Yeah, so the discussion we had on yesterday and the note that I've got for our deliberations tomorrow is that we need to reach a view of the outcome we want to achieve and then come back to you and ask for some guidance as to whether there's scope to do that.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to do that, and I think that's a good way forward.
Have we finished that discussion?
Just another
Oh,
quick
okay.
to murky the waters even more. Is there, does the plan, is it required to have any comment about method of rehabilitation or restoration? Because, and I'm actually thinking about extractive activity. If you want to enhance and restore and remediate soils that have been disturbed, animal agriculture is about the best way you can do it.
Yes, so in the rule framework and the matters of discretion for those resource consents that come in on for extraction activities. So my approach and my understanding and what I, as if I was processing a resource, so this plan for larger scale extraction activities will trigger the need for a resource consent. And in those resource consent applications, the matters of discretion direct you for things to look at and assess. And in both the rules around mining and quarrying, we've got matters of discretion which talk about remediation and management plans and that type of thing. And it's my expectation that through those resource consent processes is where you would drill into the detail of, okay, how are you going to remediate? What methods are you going to use? Is that appropriate? How do we test the soil? So this isn't, I guess this is the rule book, which then leads you to the assessment, which has got the real detail in terms of actually site-specific management of land.
I'm getting a wee bit ahead of myself, so that's great.
Sorry, I had a question on page 132. I was just for clarity, really, because the point 5 in GRUZP8, there's a new policy, but the policy is the same as 5, except there's a capital letter, but it doesn't fit with enable residential activity where it, and it just goes on to where it reverse sensitivity effects on an adjacent land. I mean, I understand the sensitivity effect, but I think the sentence needs rejigged a little. And is it the capital letter that changes the policy?
Yeah, so that is the request from the submitters. I think it was Fed Farmers and their supporters. They requested a separate policy to manage reverse sensitivity effects. However, I haven't recommended a separate policy. I've just made slight amendments. So if you, paragraph 581 on page 133, that is the recommended amendments that I've made to that policy, I didn't think it was necessary to have a completely separate policy for it. I was quite comfortable that in terms of reverse sensitivity and residential activity, which that tends to be where
Yes.
where there can
So
be
that
where
would
there
be-
can be conflict. I think it's important that it's included in that policy.
The settlement zone on page 195 and the plan provisions, we can probably deal with them both at the same time. The piece of paper in front of me actually is Appendix A, which was recommended amendments to other chapters. And I've got a note here in terms of, in each of the zones, it's been recommended that there be addition to a note 2 referring to work or activity of the Crown. Rather than having that in every zone in the plan, is there somewhere we can put it at the beginning? Because it's not a rule. How the plan works might be a place for it to go, to highlight that government agencies have special powers.
I think there's definitely potential for that. That note fell out of submissions. I think it was from McNabb Management Group, which sort of suggested that our activity rules to enable land uses on reserves that aligned with reserve management plans were unnecessary based on that RMA provision. To be totally honest, I can't remember which 42A I've written that assessment into.
It's in at least 4 or 5 of them that so far.
Well, yeah, so the reason that I guess we recommended it across the plan chapters was plan usability, to make it really clear if depending on which zone you're looking in, that is a consideration. But there probably is an argument that for efficiency it could go in the how the plan works section. It was more just making sure that the rules around land uses on reserve land, it's not just about permitting activities of the Crown, it's actually about permitting activities by others so long as they are aligning with that reserve management plan.
I've marked it here, but I know it comes up elsewhere. The policies and the rules for homestays and visitor accommodation refer to it being within a residential unit. And a residential unit is described as accommodation for a family group. So how can you have visitor accommodation in a building designed for a family group?
Do you mind just giving me a minute? I'm just going to look up definitions and understand what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and it also relates to, you've got rules for homestays and rules for visitor accommodation in each zone, and I don't know what the difference is between them.
Okay, I'll start with the definition, the difference between the two. So this comes back to the nesting tables in the interpretation chapter. So visitor accommodation would sit as on one level, and then a homestay would sit below that. And let me just check my references. Okay. So a homestay is markedly different from visitor accommodation because it has an element of somebody living on the property permanently at the same time. So the difference being a farm stay, for instance, or a bed and breakfast where someone is also on the property and provides additional service type things would be a homestay. Or if you lived in a house and you had a short-term sort of accommodation mechanism where you rented a room, visitor accommodation in relation to a residential unit is your book a batch or Airbnb type activities where the entirety of the house is rented to a separate group. The reason that these are defined differently is that for a homestay, because there's somebody living on site permanently, there's more of an element of management there. Whereas with the sort of book a batch type situations, there is an element of people being left to their own devices while utilising a residential unit. The reason that we have limited it to residential units and minor units is to do with scale, on the proviso that an activity being undertaken in a residential unit is likely to be more scale because it's based on the size of the unit. The definition of residential unit is from the National Planning Standards, and it means a building or part of a building that is used for residential activity exclusively by one household and must include sleeping, cooking, bathing and toilet facilities.
Yeah, so if it's been used exclusively by one household, how can you have visitor accommodation in it?
I guess arguably for the nights that that group is staying in there, they would be the household. I'm not sure if is there a question of you don't think it makes logical sense, or are you concerned of how the rules would be implemented in practice?
Or how some people would choose to interpret the rules. So if I had a neighbour who was wanting to oppose the fact that I've got visitor accommodation on my farm, for example, they could go to this saying, well, it's for people only in a household unit. Given that at present it says in this zone for up to 6 guests, it's quite probable that those 6 guests are not members of the same household unit. And if it's visitor accommodation, you'd normally expect to have bedrooms and bathrooms and kitchens probably provided separately, a bit like a motel, which is a household unit. So I'm just wondering whether, in fact, we need a definition of what is visitor accommodation that sits outside of the residential unit, separate from. And
I'm not sure if it's necessary based on so visitor accommodation is defined in the plan. It's about sort of paying guests and a tariff. I think what constitutes a household in this day and age, we probably need to be quite open-minded in what could be.
Okay.
So I think in practice with the definitions that we have, we've got visitor accommodation definition, we've got homestay definition, we're looking at the rules, which then have clauses around how these activities are permitted to operate, i.e. within a residential unit, maximum amount of guests. In my opinion, I think the interpretation is quite clear.
Okay. All right. Now, under Rule 5, homestay, in the rural zone, you recommend the number allowed in a homestay increase to 8. Should that also be the same case here for consistency? Presently reads 5.
In the rural zone, it's likely that the houses are quite remote and there's space on site for things like cars. And so I have recommended increased scale in that because I think based on the types of houses and situations in the rural zone, they will be further away from neighbours and such. So it was, I don't think for consistency we should increase the number of people everywhere. I think we do need to take into account where we're talking about.
That's cool, thank you. So you're allowed up to 11 guests, and if you're looking at both a visitor accommodation and homestay on the same site.
No, if someone lives on site, it would be a homestay. It wouldn't also be a visitor accommodation activity. And then if you had more guests, you would breach and need a restricted discretionary activity.
Because what I'm thinking of is that with allowed minor residential units on a property, you have the homestay guests staying in your house up to 5, and you use the other small unit that's on the property for visitor accommodation. What's to stop that happening?
I think given that the homestay can be undertaken in the residential unit or the minor unit, there's not a requirement for someone to be also living in the minor unit. So if you live on site and whether you rent out your minor unit in full and your rooms, in my mind that would still be a homestay because you were living on site at the same time. I don't think they would be split in that way. Thank you.
For consistency then, whether it's needed, is Rule 3 home business. You had indicated, I think as part of rural, that the 50 square metres be included up to 60 square metres to be consistent with the size allowed for the additional unit.
Yes, I think that was in relation to the rural zone, wasn't it, that I made that change?
So the same one happened here?
Yeah, I don't think we had submissions on this homestay rule, so it would be a consequential amendment for the panel. In terms of consistency and whether or not I would recommend doing that, I think it would pay to roll that out consistently.
And just to flag for you what I raised the other day, Rule 9 commercial activity says in number 2, must comply with the standards, and non-compliance with the standards in the standards rule is restricted discretionary, whereas non-compliance in Rule 9 is discretionary. So there's just an inconsistency there. That at some point needs to be picked up on. And it may well be that the intent is that where there is non-compliance with part 1 of that rule, that becomes discretionary. And if there's non-compliance with part 2, then it's restricted discretionary.
Yes, I agree with that. That's how it should read. If you breach that first clause, then you're discretionary. However, if you breach just a standard, then you drop down to restricted discretionary based on those matters of discretion.
Yeah. So I see that as a minor matter that isn't really changing the intent of what's there.
Agree.
And we can just tidy it up.
Agree.
Yeah. In the standard number 5, the building setback standard is changed from minimum of 4 metres to 2 metres. And there's some exceptions that an accessory building may intrude into a setback by 2 metres. So if you've got a 2 metre yard, you're actually allowing it to go in. So a consequential change to changing it from 4 to 2 is probably that exemption actually comes out of that rule.
Yes, I would agree with that.
And would you really want water tanks? I guess they've got to stay there, there's no submission on it, are allowed in that. It's not changing that at all. They're still allowed close to the boundary.
Yeah, they are allowed close to the boundary, provided that they're screened.
Yeah.
So either hedging or fencing. I think it's important that that stays.
So that also flows on then to standard 10 being the setback from the rail corridor. So if you've now got a 2 metre setback applying to the zone as a whole, then possibly in that new standard for rail corridor, what's listed there as 1 or 2 comes out. So it actually makes more sense then that you've got a 2 metre setback from the side or rear boundary, which is the railway in this case, except if your building's more than 5 metres high, you've got to be back further.
Yes, I see what you're saying. I think what might be prudent though is if you do take out 1 and 2 to include a matter of discretion in the setback sets S5 to consider the corridor if someone breaches that 2 metres.
Right, yep.
So that would only apply to likes of Pukerea, would it? Yeah.
One site.
Yeah.
And I think we had a discussion before about having rules for one site.
Yeah, and also thinking about that conversation we were having around new versus existing and what it is that we want to facilitate going forward. You know, so there are kind of interrelated things for us to think about. Yeah, because I can see for what's there already, yeah, it goes back to my question from yesterday in terms of lot sizes and if you're building new, you've got more scope around how you place your building. Yeah, which goes back to the extent to which we're imagining new development and where that's going.
Standard number 11, number 1 says within area A. I could not find area A on any map. It comes, I think, from the condition of consent, from the resource consent.
Yeah, I'd have to check the GIS maps because it was my understanding that there was different areas within that precinct.
Not that shows up on the online version of the
Yeah.
planning maps.
Yeah, I would. Can I make a note of that and come back to you on that? Because
Yeah,
I think that's
yeah.
a really important point that we make sure we don't take it out if there is a, if it is relating to a certain area, but if it's not, then we need to take it out.
And if it is relating to a certain area, fine. If it's not, then it's something we are able to monitor.
Yes, I'll confirm that for
Yeah,
you. Thank
yeah.
you.
So that was all from me in terms of the settlement zone. Did anyone else have any queries either about what was in the text or the updated plan provisions? Okay, which then takes us through to the lifestyle zone in terms of whether people have got any questions of what's in the 42A report or in the zone provisions. About 200. That's the settlement zone rules. Oh, I skipped over it. Back a little bit. But the question is if people got any questions. It actually starts back on page 177-ish. I've got a couple in terms of the updated provisions. And so far they're exactly the same as the other zone. It's just an incorrect rule number referred to in Rule 6 for the zone, but they tidy it up. And just for noting, don't need to do any change. Some of the provisions rules refers to state highway, whereas other use a more technical term. So I just need to make it consistent through the plan. So I'll pick up on that. Standard number 6 for the rural lifestyle zone, which is on page 16 of the updated one, talks about maximum building coverage on any site. It did read 1,000 square metres and it's changed to 10 square metres. Given that the zone does have some small sites in it, I'm wondering whether rather than crossing out 1,000 square metres, we actually just add 10% as well, so that the maximum building coverage is the lesser of 10% of the site area or 1,000 square metres. So on small sites, you're restricted to the size of buildings that you're allowed. Half an acre is 2,000 square metres, 200 square metre building.
Yeah, I guess that standard has been written on the anticipating that sites will be 1 hectare. I'm unaware of many existing sites that are now rural lifestyle that are less than 1 hectare. So 10% of the 10,000 would be your 1,000. Including the percentage in that rule was to actually enable, if you've got larger rural lifestyle sites, to have a slightly larger building coverage. Yeah, so are you wanting to have one or have both and then suggest the lesser of the two? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because I actually interpreted the 10% as meaning that on the smaller sites you are only allowed a smaller building.
Yeah, but the site is not going to be much smaller than 1 hectare, though, is it? If it's in the rural lifestyle zone.
Unless it's an existing one.
Yeah.
It does have some implications if someone comes with a resource consent to say we want to have an average sized lot throughout the subdivision, but with a range of smaller ones. I think there's one stage we've seen a map of something like that.
Yes, I think, without rehashing that, if there was going to be an application for a more comprehensive type development, then my expectation would be they would need to be looking at the rules and coming up with consent notices or some other mechanism to manage the built form on that specific site. I think we probably need to bear in mind that these rules will most likely, in most cases, be applied to smaller subdivision type activities, carving off lots, and therefore I just want to make sure that they were kind of appropriately applied to those rather than being changed to enable something that was a little bit more bespoke, which the resource consent would be able to look into.
So just for completeness, I've suggested a variation to the rule, the lesser of 10% or 1,000 square metres. For completeness, what's your advice? Should we stick with what you recommended or with my suggestion?
I'm quite comfortable sticking with what we've got based on the minimum lot size of 1 hectare.
I've got no further questions.
My question is around the effect of, we haven't got anything around, and I know there's no submissions on this, but trees on boundaries that grow huge, or is that amenity, or does that come under amenity on a lifestyle block.
Trees on boundaries is quite similar to
Yes, it is.
fences in terms of residential areas, in that it's often a civil matter between the two parties. I think we would struggle to propose rules regulating that type of thing through the district plan.
Could you have like a height level, like we do with fences? And
There may be standards in the transport chapter around shelter belts and shading, and therefore effects in terms of unsafe roads. We've probably got a bit of control and management in that respect, but in respect of heights of trees and boundaries, I don't consider that we've probably got scope to do that.
okay,
And
leave it as a civil matter.
yeah.
I do have probably a personal reason for asking that question, I have to say.
So for me, it was around the amendments to policy 3. So I'm looking at Appendix 2, RLZP3, where you've made some changes, and you've got a phrase at the end, can be managed, mitigated, or avoided. And I thought, is there any reason that we're not just saying avoided, remedied, or mitigated? RLZP3. So I'm not looking in the report, I'm looking at Appendix 2. Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Is it the phrasing is a bit off?
Yes,
Yeah.
so you've got managed, mitigated, or avoided, and my question was, is there any reason we're not saying avoided, remedied, or mitigated here?
No, there's no specific reason, actually. I think it would be better to align with the legal test of effects management.
Yeah, so the wording actually came from the McNabb management submission. So you're quite comfortable for it being amended?
Yes.
Anything else in terms of rural lifestyle?
Just seek some clarification. Page 180, paragraph 167, it talks about maintain the character and qualities of the rural lifestyle, and goes on to talk about doing so by managing buildings, is it not, with a view to maintain the natural character of buildings. And how do you do that? How do you natural character of a building? You make it look like a tree.
Sorry, Cliff, Commissioner Bolger, which provision are you referring to? And I'll just have a quick look.
867 on page 180 of your report. Enable buildings and structures for permitted activities that maintain the character and qualities. Look,
Yeah.
this is just a tiny point. Because somebody's actually operating in that area, if it's a natural area, but they're it's still conducting a farming area in there, and they want to put well, I suppose, in reality, you would possibly want to make sure it's not right on the top of a hill, would you, and visible from 20 k's away.
Or I imagine the way policy is worded, if someone wanted to have a huge factory farm, that does not mean the character and qualities of the zone.
Oh, fair enough. I'm yes, thinking about this.
Oh, yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. That policy is around the siting of buildings and where they are in the zone, and yeah.
I think you're right. I think we have concluded. I've got no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank those people that are watching online, staff, Joe, planners, fellow councillors, and we will
We'll adjourn, but we won't close, so we can get the additional information.
yes, we will adjourn, and we've got your number, so keep your phone on. Thank you.